Welcome to Anthodish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Dugnan. Before I introduce today's guest, I wanted to share that this is the last episode of Season 10, and it feels like a perfect topic today to end on, as we began this season looking at what it meant to feed queer communities and sustain political movements through cooking and nourishment. Today, this idea comes full circle in a really fascinating way. When it comes to talking about food, we often choose to look at what people are eating rather than how. And it's this distinction that today's guest, Amber Husain, explores in her new book, Tell Me How You Eat: Food, Power, and the Will to Live. Amber is a writer based in South London, UK. In addition to Tell Me How You Eat, she's also written Meat Love and Replace Me. Her essays on politics, literature, and art have been published in Granta, The New York Times, Baffler, and more. She has a PhD from UCL in the history of art and mind-body medicine in the late 20th century Britain. She teaches art, creative writing, and criticism. In today's conversation, Amber explores some of the ways that appetites can be re-examined and challenges persistent tropes of eating that narrow down to individual choices. Using socialist and feminist lenses, she speaks to food movements and moments in history that have revealed reasons to eat and to live, and the empowerment that comes from using food as a question rather than an answer. Here's my conversation with Amber. All right, welcome to the show, Amber. How are you doing today?
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for having me. I'm doing well.
Awesome. I'm so looking forward to chatting with you about your book. Do you mind giving listeners a bit of background about who you are, where you're coming in from today, and the type of work that you do?
Sure. So I'm coming in from London in the UK. I would describe myself as potentially many things, but for the purposes of this conversation, a writer. I have a background in literature and art history, but also philosophy and sociology. So I did my PhD in an art history department, but the topic that I wrote on is kind of fundamentally about or concerned with the history of medicine. So I'm interested in basically to try and draw together lots of different threads. I'm interested in how we can sort of use cultural forms like literature, art, and food. My last two books have been very much about food to better understand the world we live in on a social and political level. So for that reason, most of my work has quite an essayistic quality to it. I don't want to pigeonhole myself as an essayist, but I do think that that's kind of a good way that I found to try and make new associations and test out new ideas using that kind of method that I've described. Yeah.
And I was so interested to see how you're going to answer that one, because I find the different lenses that you bring into your work kind of, I mean, they dovetail so beautifully together, but you can see that there's so many different perspectives that you're braiding in there, particularly for this book, when you're looking at the idea of the female condition as this, almost failure to eat, the way that it tends to be framed somewhat like that. So how did you really start to approach that as a topic of interest, given that you're bringing in, art, sociology, philosophy, all these different lenses to look at it?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think it's kind of important to, explain a little bit what I mean when I talk about how eating disorders tend to be related to this idea of a female condition, because you might be like, oh, what the hell does that mean? But I suppose what I'm saying is my book resists reducing problems with eating to certain feminist narratives. I'm talking in particular about narratives around patriarchal beauty standards and with, I suppose, what you might call sort of adolescent autonomy or kind of control of oneself. But the book is still very much written through a feminist lens. I suppose what I'm saying is that I kind of want to just expand the definition of feminism in that case to encompass all the myriad other things that are at stake from the perspective of gender in how we eat. So, for instance, the fact that food is poorly distributed, how does that affect poor women and single mothers? Or the fact that women are held responsible for feeding their families rather than society as a whole for making sure that everybody is fed. And then, that's just how issues with the politics of food affect women on a material level. But there's also the fact that, if women are unhappy ideologically speaking with the political order, then there are barriers to participation in collective action that are gendered. So forms of disempowerment that go well beyond, a lack of control, which is the story we're often told about eating disorders. And I'm saying women a lot, but also I'm conscious that feminism is a lens that can apply to more than just women. But I'm using this kind of as a shorthand. But anyway, I mean, as you've probably guessed from how I've been talking about the book, it's also written through a socialist lens, a historical materialist lens, I'd say, one that tries to connect questions of consumption with an understanding of the systems of production that create social inequality. And then one other thing I would probably say is that there is also, I mean, there are many perspectives that inform this book, but one other important one is, I'd say there's a kind of psychoanalytic lens involved in trying to understand how our relationship to modes of production installs itself in the unconscious, affecting things like our relationship with food in sometimes very difficult to understand ways.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And I find it's one of those things where when I was reading it, it was articulating all these frustrations that I tend to have with very surface level approaches to looking at eating disorders or anorexia or, the gendered experiences of trying to relate to food in certain ways. And I'm curious, as you're approaching these sorts of topics, how did you navigate bringing all of these components together to form that argument? Because it's a significant undertaking to bring all of this together when it's not readily connected prior to.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what would have been really, really hard would be to try and kind of like either produce like a comprehensive history of Western food culture and food politics, or, to produce a grand unifying theory of eating that may or may not spring from that history. And I think more what I'm trying to do is to, there is a theory which I believe will be somewhat novel to a lot of readers in this book about what it can achieve to shift our emphasis from fixating on what we as individuals eat to how we eat, the spirit in which we eat, and how that coheres certain ideas and groups of people in interesting and productive ways. So, I mean, that said, that being the kind of unifying impulse or idea behind the book, it's also told through a very personal story of struggling to eat and then finding myself re-enchanted with eating and re-enchanted with the world, which situates how I came to this new idea about food. So in a sense, like writing this as a kind of narrative that then kind of like, shoots off in all kinds of different directions was the sort of organizing principle, because then all the different cultural and historical references that I bring in, they make sense in a certain way because they simply are just like the things that I was thinking about or encountered or that informed that personal journey. I'm laughing at the word journey because it's such a cliche, but I can't, I'm actually struggling to think of a better word.
That's fair.
So yeah, it does bring together a lot of different things, but I found, writing in the first person quite anchoring in that respect.
Yeah, I think I've also like long struggled with eating disorders and been pretty open with it on the show as well. And I think,
really?
Yeah, but I find it interesting with your book because, when you're speaking to that idea of what people eat and that fixation on that tends to take a very individualistic approach. And when you're looking at your experiences in different types of treatment cares and approaches to healing, those challenges or those limitations of the individual approach really seem to come quite visibly. So I'm curious to get your perspective on what you think contributes to this tendency for Western eating patterns to focus on this individual appetite rather than a collective or structural experience of eating.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends in a sense, who we're talking about within this, like what we would call Western society. Because from the perspective of like food corporations and, any like party that benefits from a for-profit food system, it makes sense that, there would be a desire to have consumers focus on individual diets because it's a brilliant distraction from the structural issues that affect the food system and the cost to like people of a food system that is organized around, or that kind of malnourishes people as a byproduct of being organized around making money for a small number of people. But then I guess there's another side of that, which is if you're talking about, consumers, which again is a word I hesitate to use because people are always doing more than just consuming when they eat.
Mm-hmm.
But, people who eat, let's say, there's the fact that, most of what we see online, in print media, through advertising and government messaging, all of it has to do with perfecting our individual diets to save us from poor health or other things like lack of success, culpability for climate change.
Yeah.
Any number of things, rather than showing us the forms of collective action that we might take to improve the conditions of eating. There's this whole edifice which involves many different interested parties that, without me positing sort of conspiracy, comes together to make it so that understandably people are very focused on their individual diets.
Yeah. I definitely I thought it was such a fascinating through line because it's grappling with these issues that tend to get so siloed when, as you point out very astutely, they're very much related into how we come to understand our relationship with food, our relationship with community, and who we're responsible for as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. And I suppose that's the thing that I'm really interested in is how things that we often think of as very mechanistic, like eating, as if you eat these foods and then they have this nutritional value or this ethical value, they have this effect on your body or on the planet or whatever. And instead thinking about how does eating as a rich sort of cultural practice prime us to imagine certain ways of interacting with other people in a community or interacting with nature, whether that's plants or animals or landscape or whatever.
Yeah, very much so. It reminds me too, and I always feel like I'm kind of towing the line on conspiratorial when I talk about it, but when you even look back to the history of nutrition studies and how that came to be, there's this inherent violence in who was studied in order to understand, the different nutritional components of vitamins versus proteins. And so I'm always fascinated by how that isn't necessarily still practiced to the same extent, but it still is informing how we kind of think about it as this very fractured experience of, as you said, individualizing and focusing on a key nutritive element rather than that holistic approach as well.
Yeah. And you see it kind of branching off in different directions. I mean, I don't know a huge amount about this, but I'm just thinking of, for example, personalized nutrition, that people can pay a lot of money to have someone supposedly analyze the precise things that they need to be the perfect person. But then also the huge terrain of dispute around what is even good nutrition and how this can also be very distracting from bigger questions of just the really basic one of whether enough decent food is being made available. At an affordable price to the people in the society we're talking about.
Yeah. Through that line too, I really admire how you explore fascism in relation to eating throughout the book. Speaking to that earlier forms of fascism, you make the connection between vegetable-based diets and those earlier facets of it. So can you speak a bit to that relationship between fascist moments attempt to legitimize their power through a particular form of eating?
Yeah, definitely. So while I do also talk about socialist and communitarian and first wave feminists and other movements who have adopted a vegetarian diet, I do also want to highlight the way that fascists have used vegetarianism as a way of rehearsing their ideologies. Not to say that vegetarianism is fascist, but instead to show that it's not just what you eat that matters politically, but as I kind of said before, and we'll probably say 3 more times, the spirit in which you do so. So in the history of fascism, for example, vegetarianism has often had to do with an imaginary of purity, linking bodily purity to racial purity, and linking a particular relationship to the land with ideas around ethno-nationalist superiority. This is very different from what we might call vegetarianism for the animals, by which I mean kind of an ideology that values life and is interested in imagining a political system that didn't devalue human and animal life for profit. But then I could also talk more about how different that is, again, from lots of different liberal ways of framing vegetarianism or veganism or plant-based eating.
Yeah, definitely. And it's one of those things where I always really struggle with the fascist connections with vegetarian eating because simply because you think about like the all meat diets that are being very much connected with the movements today. But I love how you framed it as like that spirit of how you're eating in terms of how that shapes those broader attitudes as well.
Yeah, it's true. And I mean, that's just another perfect example of how, like, focusing too much on what the foods are, it feels like a bit of a dead end because, you know, the far right has managed to, the contemporary far right has managed to adopt both protein and veganism as ways of constructing its various different in-groups. And we're not going to be able to understand like what is really going on with those groups politically if we stop at just saying like, oh, protein is fascist now.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Shifting gears, I was really intrigued with how you were describing food in the book because, as you had mentioned, you are bringing this personal narrative into it, and your food writing is very descriptive, but it isn't the types of descriptions that you'd see in more gourmandism or foodieist sorts of approaches. So can you talk a little bit about that, like how you describe the dishes that you're eating, because it's so vivid, but it's very uniquely your own way of looking at it as well.
I really appreciate that. I mean, whether or not it's intended as a compliment, I appreciate that observation. But I think, like, you know, I don't think I actually thought about it too much. I think if you'd asked me how I approached writing about food, I'd say like, oh, like anyone does, even though you've just really rightly distinguished it from certain kinds of quote unquote food writing. But I think that kind of naivety maybe it comes from the fact that, I mean, there's a preconception that people with eating disorders, particularly anorexia, which is the one I describe in the book, or I don't describe it too much, but it's the one I ascribe to myself at a certain period. I think there's a preconception that people with anorexia either aren't interested in food or they're kind of like, you know, so interested in it that they couldn't possibly have anything sane to say about it. Right. But I mean, let's stick with like aren't interested. I mean, whereas the fact is that food is important to everyone. And in fact, it's the fact that food is so important to everyone that gives it so much cultural, political baggage, which I think is what can make it very paralyzing sometimes. And I talk about anorexia in the book as a kind of paralysis, sort of neither an affirmative action or a complete withdrawal from the world. In my case, I found that it wasn't that I was refusing to eat completely. I was just struggling to eat enough. So part of what the book is about is trying to go back through time and really interrogate those times when I was able to eat and asking what had made that possible, like whether it was, you know, getting into veganism or just having an absorbing conversation while I was eating some dumplings or whatever. And I had a lot of fun describing those meals because eating is fun. And also life can be interesting and beautiful even when you're having a really hard time with it. So yeah, I suppose to try and answer that question in a shorter way, I wasn't really trying to form a new way of writing about food. I just felt like this was a very natural way for any person to write about food. But it did have to push through some psychological barriers to feeling like entitled to write about it in this way. I think that's kind of, you know, I think it's quite inspiring actually that you say that you've struggled with eating disorders and that you have this podcast, because like, why shouldn't you? But I think that's something, I describe this a lot in the book, is feeling almost like inhibited from really exploring what was going on with myself because, you know, you're told by society that if you have any struggles with food, then you're not entitled to think about it, talk about it, cook it for other people, you know. And this book is kind of the product of like an experience of like healing that allowed me to do otherwise.
It's really beautiful. And like the thing that really struck me with your food descriptions is that there was a balance of, especially because you're tackling issues of great hunger for populations throughout history, and you're also tackling gorging and feasting and these elements of excess, right? And I think, yeah, in terms of your descriptions, I was just awed because I don't think I've seen someone able to tackle it that way, where it's not just that kind of Food Network, oozy, you know what I mean? Like that sort of like yum
Yeah,
yum sort of
yeah.
food.
Yeah. Well, I guess because the food descriptions, they're never an end in themselves. It's always like
Yeah.
a medium through which to ask another question. And I found that really enjoyable.
I love that. So we spoke a little bit about the female condition and how eating disorders are connected with that at the beginning. You talk about the idea of food panics in different moments of history, and how, can you talk about how they have these gendered components and how gender relates to how people thought or panicked about food?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we see this in a sense, like at various points in history, how I talk in particular about how the private household became a site of what you might call responsibilization, meaning that if there's not enough food or affordable food, it's up to you as a family rather than, or, you know, whatever household, rather than governments or communities to take care of your own. And when it comes to home economics, that has traditionally meant it's up to women. I mean, in the book, I talk about the idea of the witch that was produced in medieval and early modern times, and how it's kind of an incredible illustration how this came out directly almost of this impossible demand that women make up for all the problems that were caused by the early privatization of land. So when food production went from following reliable patterns and cycles to being a commercial enterprise, which inevitably involves spikes and crashes. And this is something that Silvia Federici very famously wrote about in her book Caliban and the Witch. You know, there were these chronic famines and there was malnutrition. And at the same time, this new role for women was emerging as keepers of the home. And through that kind of, you know, non-coincidental coincidence, when people got sick or died or were hungry, it was women who were blamed. And there's so much interesting stuff in the record of witch trials. And then Diane Purkis, the food historian, writes about this really interestingly she has a whole book on this subject. Yeah, there's so much interesting stuff about women allowing poisons or curses to enter their home or infiltrating other people's homes or even their bodies, like poisoning their breast milk, poisoning their children. And, you know, we still see, if not in such dramatic or melodramatic terms, this massive burden on mothers to ensure like good nutrition for their families, even if most of what is available and palatable isn't that nutritious. So yeah, I mean, that's just one other way in which kind of like a feminist, I suppose, perspective informs how I was thinking about feeding in the book, because there's a whole chapter on feeding that isn't entirely to do with, you know, women and their own bodies, even though there is a whole other thread there about like the suspicion in which we hold women who struggle to eat themselves when they are still interested in feeding other people. Because feeding isn't just an act through which people poison, dominate, exploit each other. It is also a very important act of care and, you know, like love and mutual sustenance and like all of these other things. So it's about kind of like how to negotiate the complexity of that without creating scapegoats.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love the exploration that you did too of feminist movements in particular periods where feeding was able to continue the movements, and not necessarily always in a glorious way or a glamorized way, because the constraints of finances or budgets for restaurants and stuff too. But I thought that was a really fantastic exploration of the other part of that as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there's quite a few. I mean, there's a few different things that popped into my head when you were saying that. I saw you had Alex Ketchum on the podcast recently. Yeah,
I love Alex.
Who has an amazing book about feminist restaurants and how there's a history of women creating kind of like commercial or semi-commercial spaces to come together and do more than just sit and eat together, but like actually make, you know, political plans and have discussions. But then there's also, you know, a lot of discussion in the book about attempts at kind of utopian, prefigurative attempts to create communes and units of mutual aid that were bigger than a family, but not quite as big as like, you know, a whole society yet. but just to
Yeah.
kind of theatrically stage like what that would be like, which involved people. I talk about the poet Diane de Prima, like harnessing a mothering impulse without it necessarily being to do with being a biological mother. Yeah. And then, I mean, there are obviously loads of ways in which that impulse feeds into food work currently, whether it's like mutual aid type food organizing, or whether it's literally just like feeding people at political meetings and protests and stuff like that.
Yeah, which I find is one of those pieces where obviously it's such an important element to continuing those movements, and then quite often gets taken for granted or underlooked in certain ways.
Mm.
In terms of how you're looking at food toward the end, you frame hunger as a political choice, which I think is a really important piece. So what gets maintained if we dismiss that idea and look solely at the idea of food bringing us together rather than its connections with hunger being a political choice as well?
I think it's an interesting contrast to make. I think the idea that food brings us together, which obviously it sometimes does, but the idea that it necessarily does is this kind of vaguely hopeful, but also, you know, possibly irresponsible thing that people say that chimes with the idea I talk about in the book, that you are what you eat, in that both involve the idea that food has these inherent qualities and we just need to sort of press go on them and everything will be fine. Whereas in fact, I mean, the fact is that while of course food can bring people together, food on its own is not enough. It's about how food brings people together, and thinking about that does demand a bit more from us. So like I could be shopping in the same supermarket as someone from a completely different socioeconomic background, but we wouldn't have like the power to get the same stuff or the opportunity to eat it in the same rooms. Depending on how you instrumentalize it, food can be a way of hierarchizing people or dividing them as much as bringing them together. And of course, it can also be used as a weapon of war, like as we've been seeing in Gaza and Sudan and elsewhere. And to actually answer your question, which is kind of what is lost or what happens, when we acknowledge this, then we're sort of forced to take the power of food more seriously as a question rather than an assumption, I think. You know, we're forced to be specific about the political dynamics that shape how we eat, and also decide which side we want to be on. Because if you do just say, oh, if, you know, food brings us together, then it's kind of like almost like an abdication from thinking about, you know, how it doesn't always.
Yeah. And to me, I find it very dismissive, particularly depending on who's conveying that message. If it's,
yeah, of course,
you know, yeah, like it to deny what's happening with genocides and what's happening with starvations and famines while you're talking about, you know, gourmet burgers and writing. Like, to me, that's also that area where I find it really difficult to navigate. And I think, too, your book illuminated for me how we're really enhancing that individualistic, personalized nutrition component at a same time where we are witnessing these like horrific famines and genocides as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thinking about the book being out in the world now, what are some of the takeaways that you would like people to have in terms of continuing these investigations into how people are eating?
You know, I hope readers will find it interesting, obviously. There's a lot of history and culture in there. But I do hope that they'll find it liberating. And I think that, you know, in what way they find it liberating will really depend so much on the reader. But there is something very freeing about thinking about diet as a cultural practice rather than just a space of individual duty. But, you know, of course, if you're that way inclined, there's also something very politically hopeful in it. Writing this book for me was a kind of, it wasn't just like a re-enchantment with life. It was also about reconnecting with political possibility and the way, like through the way that, you know, people who have changed the world in some way have in part been inspired to do so through something to do with how they ate. Whether it was about like creating a certain expectation of pleasure or whatever it was, whether it was just about fuel. Yeah, it's really about like, I hope that it will be a hopeful book for people. I think if any of that rubs off on people, then I'd be really happy.
I love that. It reminds me, I don't know if you've read Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Message at all?
Oh, I actually haven't.
Oh, it's so great. But it reminds me of this piece in, I think earlier in the book, where he talks about that power of imagining futures and and that ability to imagine and envision and create a different future. And I think your book really brings that component in as well, of by making food a question, allowing a reimagination of what can come of food systems as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I will go away and read that.
Yeah. It's a pretty quick read, but it's lasted for me at least.
Great.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Amber, for chatting with me about your book. I really enjoyed it. Do you mind sharing where people can find you online if they'd like to follow along and learn more from you?
Oh, thank you so much. So I do have a website. It's amberhusain.com, Husain, where I post some new work. But I guess the most live place where I'm sharing stuff is on Instagram. So people can find me there.
Perfect. I'll put that on the show notes. Thank you so much, Amber. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks.
That was Amber Husain. I've linked her new book, website, and social media in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at our website at anthodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to Anthodish Podcast. This was the last episode of Season 10. The podcast will be on a break until fall 2026. In the meantime, though, you can find what I'm up to by signing up for my newsletter, Anthodish Essays, at sarahdignan.substack.com. You can subscribe to my channel on YouTube and follow along over at TikTok, Instagram, Threads, or Blue Sky for more updates, which may include some fun TV show work that will be coming out soon. Thank you so much for tuning into this season. I'm so thrilled with the depth and the range of conversations of Season 10, and so thankful to all of the guests whose work and experiences have really lit inspiration for me. The world can feel incredibly bleak and hopeless, but grounding in conversations that imagine new food futures and unearth important knowledge to challenge the absurdity of power and fascism and violence is more important than ever. I hope these interviews bring you that motivation to keep going as well. Music production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. Anthodish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in late September or early October 2026. Take care.